Imagine achieving the ultimate modern dream. You spend years grinding away, building a company from the ground up, sacrificing sleep and relationships, and then, well, finally the day comes. You sell the company for a nine-figure sum.
Oh, wow. Yeah. The absolute peak.
Right. Hundreds of millions of dollars are wired into your bank account. You have officially won the game of capitalism. But the very next morning, instead of waking up to a profound sense of peace and euphoria, you open your eyes and are instantly crushed by an overwhelming wave of emptiness and just sheer paralyzing dread.
It's terrifying, honestly, because it shatters our fundamental assumptions about what is supposed to make a human life worthwhile. We operate under this collective delusion that if we can just acquire enough resources or secure the perfect title, the suffering stops.
Yeah, the finish line fixes everything.
Exactly. The dread of that entrepreneur arriving at the summit and finding nothing there, well, it forces us to reevaluate the entire machinery of human motivation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are undertaking a massive mission. We are going to explore the mechanics of becoming your true self. We're looking at the hidden architecture of why we do what we do and the surprising, almost terrifying utility of our darkest struggles.
And how we're supposed to navigate an increasingly virtual, chaotic world without completely losing our minds.
Right, because we are pulling all of this from an incredibly profound, far-reaching recorded conversation between a highly successful young entrepreneur and a world-renowned clinical psychologist.
The scope of their dialogue is staggering, to be honest. They cover the psychological barricades that prevent you from, cleaning a messy bedroom, and they scale all the way up to existential philosophy, the biological temperaments driving our political divides, and macro-level societal reactions to global crises.
It's a lot of ground to cover. Our goal is to extract the core mechanisms behind these ideas. We want to understand the why and the how of human behavior as presented in this source.
Yeah, we are really breaking down the foundational operating system of the human mind, according to the speaker.
Before we jump into the deep end, let's set the stage. Today is Tuesday, April 14th, 2026, and I need to say this up front. This source material gets into some deeply sensitive, highly politically charged territory. It touches on left-wing and right-wing ideologies, sweeping critiques of government pandemic policies, and heavy scrutiny of pharmaceutical companies.
Right, it goes into some very intense, polarized topics.
Exactly. So, listeners, you know our rule. We are applying strict neutrality here.
We are operating as impartial cartographers. Our sole function today is to map out the arguments and the worldview of the speaker exactly as they were presented in the original transcript. We are exploring the philosophical and psychological underpinnings of these claims.
We are neither endorsing nor condemning any of these viewpoints.
Right, absolutely not. We are simply giving you the topographical layout of the ideas so you can explore the terrain yourself.
Okay, so the conversation begins in a place of raw vulnerability. The interviewer, this highly successful entrepreneur, shares a deeply personal story about a romantic relationship that eventually fell apart.
Yeah, it's a very striking opening.
It really is. For a long time, he was trying to be the person he assumed his partner wanted him to be. He admits he was, well, wearing a mask. But as the relationship entered its final dying stages, something shifted.
Because he had nothing left to lose.
Exactly. He dropped the mask. He started speaking with unvarnished, brutal honesty. And the paradox he experienced was that in the very act of the relationship ending, the human connection between them suddenly became stronger and more profound than it had ever been when they were supposedly happy.
What's fascinating here is the underlying psychological mechanism. The clinical psychologist brings in Carl Jung, specifically Jung's concept of the persona.
Right, the persona, which gets a bad rap these days.
It really does. In modern pop psychology, there is a tendency to flatten this concept and declare that all masks are inherently toxic, and we must all exist in a state of unfiltered, radical authenticity at all times. But Jung's framework is far more nuanced.
Oh, so?
Well, he viewed the development of a persona not as a pathology, but as a necessary developmental milestone. When you are an infant, you are an undifferentiated mass of instinct and emotion. As you mature, you must learn to formulate an avatar, a functional shell, to mediate between your raw, chaotic internal landscape and the highly structured external social world.
So it's a protective mechanism for the social fabric itself.
It is the grease that keeps the gears of society turning. The expert gives a highly practical example. Consider a bank teller. When you walk into a bank and ask the teller how their day is going, you are engaging in a social ritual.
You require them to wear the functional shell of the polite bank teller.
Right. If they were to drop that persona and immediately trauma dump their deepest insecurities, their financial terrors, or their marital problems onto you, the social interaction would instantly collapse. The persona acts as a vital buffer. It prevents overwhelming intimacy from short-circuiting casual encounters.
The danger then isn't that you own a mask. The danger is what happens when you forget how to take it off, when that functional shell becomes the entirety of your existence.
Yeah, when the mask fuses to the face.
Exactly. The source suggests that when that happens, the real person trapped underneath begins to suffocate. They become desperate and profoundly inadequate because their external actions no longer reflect any true internal reality.
They become a shell enclosing a void. The psychologist uses the analogy of Pinocchio to illustrate the terror of the state. Pinocchio is a brilliant cultural artifact because he is simultaneously a puppet and an actor.
Oh, that is a great way to look at it.
It really raises an important question for anyone caught in the trap of perpetual performance. If you are acting out a role purely to be palatable, popular, or desirable, who actually wrote the script you are performing? And perhaps more terrifyingly, who is pulling the strings?
That imagery of the puppet strings, it maps perfectly onto the digital world. Think about the social media algorithms you interact with every day. We actively craft digital avatars, curated versions of our lives on various platforms to acquire likes, to signal virtue, to appear successful.
We think we're using the tool.
But very quickly, the algorithm begins pulling the strings. It rewards your avatar for expressing outrage or for adopting a certain aesthetic. So to keep getting the reward, the real flesh and blood human begins to alter their actual behavior to match the digital avatar.
It's a terrifying feedback loop.
It is. We become puppets to our own curated image, manipulated by an invisible code designed to harvest our attention.
Jung argued that every human being is acting out a myth, whether they are conscious of it or not. When you surrender your autonomy to the algorithm or to the expectations of the crowd, you are acquiescing to a role that you did not author.
You're just playing a part.
Exactly. You might find yourself acting out a tragedy or a myth of hollow narcissism simply because you thought it was what the audience demanded. The source is adamant that the genuine adventure of your life and any real connection with another human being, well, it is entirely contingent on stripping away that artifice.
Which is what the interviewer finally experienced as his relationship ended. But if we know that we need the persona to function in society, so we aren't traumatizing the bank teller, but we also desperately need absolute truth to have a meaningful life, how does the source suggest we bridge that gap?
Yeah, how do you take the mask off without burning your life to the ground and alienating everyone around you?
Right, exactly. What's the practical application there?
The bridge is constructed through agonizing humility and acute contextual awareness. You retain the functional shell for the bank teller, but you must systematically dismantle it in the presence of your intimate partners, your close friends, and critically, when you are alone with yourself.
And I imagine the source warns that this transition is inherently painful.
Extremely painful. Dropping a mask means you are no longer shielded by the illusion of perfection. You are forced to come to terms with your actual inadequacies, your petty resentments, and your flaws. It is an ego-shattering process. But avoiding that pain guarantees you will forfeit the adventure of your own life to play a bit part in someone else's play.
This concept of forfeiting the adventure leads directly into the next massive theme, the architecture of aspiration. Let's say you wake up and realize you were playing a bit part in a terrible play. You look at your life, maybe you're trapped in a soul-sucking job, and you can clearly envision the person you could be.
You see the potential adventure.
Right. Yet the interviewer points out this tragic phenomenon where people actively choose the certainty of their current miserable reality over the uncertainty of pursuing that potential.
It is the paralysis of preferring the devil you know. The uncertainty of the unknown is biologically processed by the human brain as a threat. But the clinical psychologist in the source provides a surgically precise method for dismantling this paralysis.
He applies a clinical framework to the example of a dead-end job, right?
Yes. The instinct is often to just quit in a blaze of glory or to sink into a state of resentful apathy. The necessary first step, instead, is aggressive differentiation. You must take the vague, overwhelming cloud of misery and fracture it into highly specific, manageable data points.
You have to interrogate the misery. Is the job actually repetitive and boring? Is your specific manager a tyrant? Or are you fundamentally bringing more value to the company than you are being compensated for? You have to isolate the variable.
Let us assume the isolated variable is that you are undervalued. You are highly competent, but underpaid and overlooked. The source outlines a strategic, step-by-step methodology that is rooted in extreme pragmatism. Step one is confronting your own professional reflection. You get your resume in order.
Which sounds simple, but it's really not.
Not at all. In a clinical setting, a client might resist this, admitting they have a 3-year gap in their employment history, or they dropped out of a degree program. They feel deep shame about the inadequacies on the paper. The clinical response is to drag that inadequacy into the light.
This is where the advice pivots from abstract philosophy to hard-hitting reality. If you have a hole in your resume, you don't try to hide it with fancy formatting. You address the gap.
You have to face it head on.
Yeah, the source suggests finding a 6-month online course or certification related to your field. You don't need a 4-year degree. You need tangible evidence of forward momentum. So when you eventually sit in an interview and they point out the gap, you look them in the eye and say, I recognize that deficit in my skill set, and 6 months ago, I enacted a concrete plan to rectify it. Here is the certification.
That response entirely neutralizes the inadequacy. It demonstrates high-level self-awareness, conscientiousness, and the ability to execute a plan. From an employer's perspective, those traits are often more valuable than the original credential would have been.
That makes total sense. So what's step 2?
Once the resume is fortified, you move to step 2. You do not march into your boss's office to complain. You silently go out and apply for 10 other jobs.
You go on the offensive, but quietly. You take interviews. You test the market to see what your skills are actually worth. Maybe you secure a firm offer from a competitor. You are building leverage.
Leverage is the mechanism of power in a negotiation. Only when you have established that leverage do you proceed to step 3. You approach your current boss. You do not approach from a position of grievance or victimization. You approach from a position of formidable competence.
You lay out the exact value you bring to the organization.
Exactly. You present a roadmap of what you could accomplish if they provide a 40% raise and a clear trajectory for advancement, and you calmly note that you have already explored your market value elsewhere.
So what does this all mean? The source distills this entire process down to a single striking phrase. You must think like a snake. You have to meticulously study the terrain, get all your details perfectly aligned, keep your eyes locked unblinkingly on the prize, and be entirely prepared to bite if necessary.
It's a very provocative metaphor.
It is. And honestly, I have to challenge this framing a bit. We're talking about becoming your true, authentic, virtuous self. Advising someone to adopt the psychological posture of a venomous reptile, secretly interviewing, building leverage, and threatening to leave, well, it feels manipulative. How does the source reconcile this seemingly dark strategy with the pursuit of a virtuous life?
If we connect this to the bigger picture the source is painting, the conflict only exists if you conflate virtue with harmlessness. There is a pervasive cultural myth that being a good person means being a passive, endlessly accommodating pushover.
Right, the nice guy syndrome.
Precisely. But if you are dealing with a tyrannical bureaucracy, an exploitative boss, or an unfair system, harmlessness is not a virtue. It is an invitation to be victimized. To combat unfairness effectively, you cannot rely on polite requests. You must become strategically formidable.
So the snake represents competence.
The snake metaphor represents calculated precision, cold rationality, and the possession of a dangerous capability that you hold in reserve. True virtue in this framework is possessing the capacity for aggression and choosing to keep it sheathed until absolutely necessary to enforce a boundary.
It's the ancient concept of the warrior in the garden. It is better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. You need the fangs, even if you never intend to use them, because their mere existence changes the dynamic of the ecosystem.
That's exactly it. The capability changes how the world treats you.
But this entire strategy assumes a baseline level of self-awareness. You have to know what your skills are, and you have to be able to identify the gaps in your resume. What if someone is so lost, so deeply entrenched in their own misery, that they don't even know what they don't know? How do you generate self-awareness from scratch?
The methodology proposed here sounds almost theological, but it is anchored in rigorous psychological utility. It involves a specific, desperate form of internal dialogue. The instruction is to sit on the edge of your bed at the end of the day.
Just sit on the bed.
Yes. You must clear away the distractions and enter a state of absolute brutal honesty. You have to acknowledge the bitterness and resentment that your suffering is causing you. And in that state, you ask yourself one highly calibrated question.
So, if someone is sitting there staring at the floor, completely lost, what are they actually supposed to ask? It can't just be some vague plea like, how do I fix my life?
The question must be extremely precise. You ask the darkness, what is one thing I am doing wrong, that I know I'm doing wrong, that I could fix, that I would fix?
Wow, that's incredibly specific.
It is. The expert asserts with absolute certainty that if you pose this question sincerely, without attempting to manipulate the outcome, you will receive an answer from your own subconscious. But it will inevitably be an answer that deeply offends your ego. It will not point you toward a grand heroic crusade. It will point you toward something humiliatingly small, mundane, and intensely irritating.
It's like debugging a massive piece of software. If you have an operating system that keeps crashing, you don't just delete millions of lines of code and try to rewrite the whole thing from memory. You run a diagnostic to find the one single syntax error, like a misplaced comma or a broken loop that is currently throwing an error code right in front of you.
That's a brilliant way to frame it.
You fix that one microscopic error, then you compile the code, run it again, and see what breaks next.
The software analogy is a perfect translation of the psychological mechanism at play. The source relies on a quote from Carl Jung to drive this home. Jung said, "People in the modern world don't see God because they don't look low enough."
They don't look low enough.
The human ego craves grand narratives. If we are miserable, we want the solution to be a massive revolution of our entire existence. We want to overthrow the system or move to a new country. But when you ask that question on the edge of the bed, the subconscious usually replies with something like, "Look at the floor. Your bedroom is a disaster. Start by picking up your dirty clothes."
And the immediate knee-jerk reaction is sheer pride. I am wrestling with the existential dread of modern life and the futility of the cosmos. I am far too intellectually complex to be worried about vacuuming my rug.
The source labels that reaction as an overdose of pure, unadulterated arrogance. The logic is devastatingly straightforward. If you consider yourself too important or too paralyzed to organize the small physical space over which you have absolute sovereign control, how could you possibly possess the competence required to reorder your career, fix your relationships, or critique the macroeconomic structures of society?
It literally can't.
You cannot restructure the world if you cannot bring yourself to scrub your own toilet. You have to start at the absolute bottom. By executing that micro-improvement, by organizing the room, you generate the localized dopaminergic reward and the psychological momentum necessary to tackle the next layer of chaos.
You practice imposing order on chaos in a low-stakes environment. And speaking of the larger structures of society, the conversation takes a fascinating turn here into the realm of privilege. The concept of unearned privilege dominates our current cultural discourse, usually weaponized as a political tool to induce guilt or demand systemic restructuring.
It's everywhere right now.
It really is.
Okay.
But the psychologist approaches this explosive topic through the lens of deep existential philosophy. He acknowledges that the radical left's critique of unearned privilege is fundamentally accurate, but his explanation for why it exists and what we are supposed to do about it completely subverts the standard political narrative.
To understand this, we have to delve into the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, specifically his concept of thrownness. Heidegger argued that human beings do not arrive in reality as blank slates, carefully selecting our optimal starting conditions. We are violently thrown into existence.
Thrown, like no choice in the matter.
None at all. You are thrown into a specific historical era, into a specific genetic code, into a specific socioeconomic class. You might be thrown into extreme poverty, or you might be thrown into a stable democracy with wealthy parents, high intelligence, and perfect health. You did not earn any of these starting parameters. They are arbitrary gifts or curses of fate.
So you find yourself holding this immense unearned privilege. But the source insists that this privilege does not exist in a vacuum. It is inextricably tethered to a profound existential guilt.
The guilt stems from a clear-eyed assessment of history. The stable democracy, the wealth, the infrastructure, the universities, all the very foundations that allow your unearned privilege to exist, well, they were built upon millennia of horrific human suffering, brutal warfare, slavery, and subjugation. The ground we walk on is literally and metaphorically soaked in the blood of historical atrocity.
That is heavy.
It is. The existential terror, as the source points out, is recognizing that the capacity for those same atrocities does not just belong to abstract villains in history books. The adversary, the potential for that darkness, resides fundamentally within the architecture of your own human heart.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To illustrate this paralyzing realization, he uses a brilliant analogy from a seemingly unlikely source, Guy Ritchie's movie King Arthur. In the film, Arthur is finally presented with Excalibur, the ultimate tool of supreme power. but he physically recoils. He hesitates to pick it up.
Because of the vision.
Yes, because whenever he touches it, he is flooded with visions of his murderous uncle, who previously wielded that exact same sword to slaughter innocent people and consolidate a tyrannical reign.
The sword represents the instruments of privilege and power. Wealth, education, status, societal influence. Arthur's hesitation is the manifestation of existential guilt. You look at the immense tools at your disposal and you suddenly realize they are the exact same tools that human beings have historically weaponized to oppress, exploit, and destroy one another.
So the haunting question becomes, how dare you pick up that sword, knowing full well the catastrophic damage that human beings, including yourself, are capable of inflicting with it? The easiest, most cowardly path is to simply leave the sword in the stone, to renounce your privilege, performative or otherwise, so you don't have to carry the terrifying responsibility of wielding it correctly.
But dropping the sword or apologizing endlessly for the fact that you were born near it doesn't actually fix anything.
Exactly. So how does the source suggest we resolve this? How do you carry the weight of unearned privilege and the historical guilt attached to it without being crushed by the burden or corrupted by the power?
The proposed resolution is the central pillar of his entire philosophy. You must pay for the luxury of your unearned privilege with the currency of your virtue. You cannot travel back in time and undo your thrownness. You cannot uninherit the blood-soaked history of your civilization.
The bill is due.
The bill is due. The only way to expiate the existential guilt is to take the arbitrary gifts you were given and utilize them to live the most maximally good, truthful, and productive life possible. You bear the burden of speaking the truth, you treat the individuals around you with inherent dignity, and you put your own house in perfect order. Your rigorous pursuit of the good is the rent you pay for your existence.
It completely reframes the concept of privilege. It takes it from being a permanent, paralyzing stain of original sin and transforms it into a profound call to adventure. And understanding that every life carries its own unique burden of thrownness brings us to the Ferrari anecdote in the source. This is the ultimate reality check for anyone consumed by envy over someone else's apparent privilege.
Bro, this is such a powerful visualization.
Right. Imagine you are a young guy struggling to make ends meet, and a man your age drives past in a pristine, bright red Ferrari. Sitting next to him is a strikingly beautiful woman. The immediate biological response is a surge of intense, resentful envy. You think, the universe is rigged, he has everything I want, and I have nothing.
That envy is a massive cognitive error. It relies on a superficial, two-dimensional reading of reality. You are isolating the visible markers of success, the car and the companion, and ignoring the invisible complexities of human suffering.
Because you don't know the whole story.
The source demands that you look deeper into the reality of the situation you are envying. What if you possessed omniscient knowledge of that car? What if you knew that the beautiful woman was trapped in a cycle of severe, drug-addicted prostitution, masking deep childhood trauma? What if the man gripping the steering wheel is a total fraud, his entire financial empire is a house of cards built on deceit, and he is driving around in a state of absolute nauseating terror because he knows the indictments are coming down tomorrow?
If you knew the whole truth, you wouldn't touch his life with a 10-foot pole. You don't actually want his fate. You just want the shiny snapshot. If you made a deal with the universe to take his car, you would be forced to take his impending catastrophe, his terror, and his trauma along with it. Your own life, your own struggles, your own messy bedroom, your own difficult path to telling the truth, it contains more than enough meaningful adventure for one lifetime.
Envy blinds us to the foundational truth that every human existence is an intricate tapestry of unearned privileges and devastating curses. Reducing someone's life to a material snapshot strips them of their humanity and poisons your own potential.
This inherent complexity of human suffering leads to one of the most jarring admissions in the entire transcript. We talked earlier about the interviewer selling his company for a 9-figure sum and waking up with a profound sense of dread. He achieved the Ferrari, he achieved the absolute pinnacle of financial success, and his psychological reward was a terrifying emptiness.
The clinical framework for this experience is referred to as gold medal depression. Psychologists observe this phenomenon consistently in Olympic athletes.
After they win, right?
Yes. These individuals organize the entirety of their neurological and physical existence around a single, highly defined goal. They train for a decade, they arrive at the Olympics, they perform flawlessly, and they win the gold medal. The anthem plays, the crowd cheers. But weeks later, they frequently spiral into a profound, destabilizing clinical depression.
Why does that happen?
The underlying reason for this crash is rooted in our evolutionary biology. Human beings are fundamentally built to walk uphill.
We are built to walk uphill. We literally aren't designed to rest comfortably at the summit.
Our dopaminergic reward systems are triggered by the pursuit of a desired goal, not merely the attainment of it. When you reach the peak, the mechanism that generates meaning and positive emotion suddenly shuts off because there is no more forward to move toward. You can pause at the summit to catch your breath and appreciate the view, but the psychological machinery of human fulfillment dictates that you must rapidly identify a new, higher, more difficult peak in the distance, or you will begin to decay.
The source dives into the etymology of the word enthusiasm to explain this. He points out that enthusiasm literally translates to being filled with the Spirit of God. And he makes the staggering claim that human beings only ever experience this profound, animating positive emotion in direct relationship to a moving goal.
And the nature of that goal is critical. It cannot be a trivial pursuit. It must be a transcendent goal. The fascinating paradox he introduces is that for a goal to sustain you across the entire span of a human life, it must be theoretically unattainable. It must act as a horizon that constantly recedes as you approach it.
It instantly makes me think of the Greek myth of Sisyphus, the king who was condemned to roll a massive boulder up a steep hill, only to watch it roll back down to the bottom every time he neared the top, for all eternity.
It is the exact geometry of the Sisyphus myth, but the psychological interpretation is inverted. In the myth, the repetitive labor is a divine punishment. It is the ultimate curse of futility. But the source argues that for the human psyche, this structure is deeply enriching.
Because of the transformation.
Yes, as you pursue that receding transcendent goal, you are forced into a continuous process of self-correction. The friction of the climb burns away your deadwood. You become more resilient, more articulate, more competent. The pursuit itself transforms you, filling your life with abundant meaning, even if the final destination remains perpetually out of reach.
Which completely vaporizes the narrative that modern society constantly sells us. Every commercial for financial planning, every advertisement for the lottery, it all sells us this vision of the ultimate finish line. Retiring at 50, moving to a beach, sipping Mai Tais, and never engaging in difficult labor again. It's pitched as the ultimate reward of capitalism.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of human neurobiology, that cultural narrative is worse than false. It is psychologically lethal. The expert in the source rejects the beach retirement fantasy with absolute disdain. He frames it not as a pinnacle of success, but as a desire for a drug-induced coma.
A coma. That's brutal.
It might provide relief for a week or a month after a long career, but eventually the fundamental biological imperative for purpose will reassert itself. Without an uphill climb, consciousness turns in on itself. The imagery the source uses is visceral and horrifying. He asks if your ultimate ambition is truly to regress into being a giant infant with a gold bottle laying on your back and sucking.
That is a terrifying visual. But it drives the point home flawlessly. We aren't built to be passive consumers of comfort.
The necessary archetype for human flourishing is the active warrior. It is the individual moving steadily uphill, sword in hand, actively confronting the chaos of the unknown. And the source makes a brilliant, macro-level sociological observation here. He points out that this deep biological craving for an uphill struggle, for a dragon to slay, is precisely why millions of young men are disappearing into the simulated realities of video games.
Because the real world isn't providing it.
Exactly. If the physical, cultural world denies them a meaningful path of resistance, or worse, labels their natural drive for conquest and ambition as inherently toxic, they will inevitably seek out a virtual environment that satisfies the evolutionary craving. The video game offers exactly what reality is withholding: a clearly defined goal, progressive levels of difficulty, and immediate, tangible rewards for increasing competence.
We've established that the individual needs to face the dragon in their own messy bedroom to find meaning. But what happens when an entire society starts abandoning the dragons in the real world and moves into virtual ones? This brings us to a massive tectonic shift, discussed in the source, the virtualization of reality. And it's not just gamers retreating into digital spaces.
No, it's a structural shift in how we work and live.
Right. The conversation directly addresses the massive global migration toward remote work and digital existence that has fundamentally altered society over the last few years. The interviewer, despite running a tech-heavy business, expresses a profound mourning for the physical office space. He realizes that 90% of his closest friends and former romantic partners were met in the messy, embodied environment of a shared workspace, and he looks at a future of staring at a grid of Zoomed faces with genuine dread.
The psychologist's analysis of this digital migration is intensely layered. He does not deny the astonishing efficiency of modern technology. They are, ironically, recording this very dialogue using sophisticated remote studio technology. But he mounts a fierce, philosophically grounded defense of physical, embodied reality over the cold metric of virtual efficiency.
Because we don't fully understand what we're replacing.
Precisely. His core argument is that human beings do not possess a sufficiently deep understanding of our own physical environments or the subtle biological interactions occurring within them to safely virtualize them without losing something vital.
He illustrates this perfectly by analyzing the modern university.
Hmm.
If you view a university strictly through the lens of a data transfer mechanism, just moving information from a textbook into a student's brain, then virtualizing the entire institution makes perfect economic sense. You can record one brilliant lecture, broadcast it to 100,000 laptops for pennies, and administer multiple-choice tests online. It is the pinnacle of efficiency.
But reducing education to mere data transfer strips away its primary evolutionary function. The source argues that the true utility of a university is far more complex and fundamentally reliant on physical embodiment. A four-year degree is a socially sanctioned, structured ritual designed to force young people to leave the safety of their childhood homes, physically sever the immediate dependence on their parents, and undergo the terrifying, necessary process of forging new peer networks.
It is a laboratory where you learn the mechanics of coexisting with strangers.
Yes. This leads to one of the most vivid anecdotes in the transcript, the story of the tough guy, lid smelter cowboy roommate.
Oh, I loved this part.
It is a masterful illustration of evolutionary biology in action, specifically the concept of reciprocal altruism. The speaker recounts living in close quarters with an older, rugged, working-class roommate. What is crucial is what they didn't do. They never sat down at a table and drafted a contractual, itemized roommate agreement regarding household chores.
Right, there's no spreadsheet.
Instead, they established a peaceful, cooperative equilibrium through silent, continuous, physical observation of one another in a shared space. One roommate would organically take on the burden of buying groceries. The other would observe this sacrifice and naturally respond by waking up early to cook breakfast. They instinctively tracked mutual obligations and executed a complex dance of reciprocity.
You absolutely cannot virtualize that dance. You cannot learn reciprocal altruism on a Slack channel or during a tightly scheduled 30-minute Zoom call where you only interact with a two-dimensional image of someone from the shoulders up. Reciprocal altruism requires the friction of 247 embodied presence.
Okay.
To me, it's the difference between consuming a scientifically engineered nutrient paste and sitting down to a loud, chaotic family dinner.
That's a great analogy.
The nutrient paste might deliver the exact same vitamins and caloric data transfer as the dinner, but you completely obliterate the culture, the subtle body language, the spontaneous conversation, and the core humanity of the experience. Remote work, when taken to its extreme, risks becoming the nutrient paste of human careers.
That is a highly accurate modern translation of his point. And the source warns that this blind pursuit of frictionless efficiency carries catastrophic risks. He invokes a foundational conservative philosophical doctrine here, the law of unintended consequences. We invent a tool to solve a specific problem, assuming it will only perform that single function. We think a smartphone is just a more efficient telephone, but it fundamentally rewrites the neurochemistry of human interaction.
It changes who we are.
The speaker provocatively speculates that a platform like Twitter, by algorithmically hijacking our evolutionary vulnerabilities to outrage and tribalism, might literally possess the capacity to bring democratic civilization to a halt.
He actually brings Karl Marx into this critique of technology, which is a fascinating crossover.
Yes, he deploys Marx's concept of alienation, but updates it for the digital age. Marx originally theorized that the repetitive mechanistic nature of assembly line factory work alienated the laborer from the artisanal joy and human fulfillment of creating a complete, tangible product. The source applies this exact dynamic to our modern technological ecosystem.
We're alienated from our own nature.
Exactly. Our devices make us exponentially more productive, but their cold, algorithmic artificiality dangerously alienates us from the organic, friction-filled, embodied world we biologically evolved to inhabit. We are optimizing our society for maximum efficiency, and in the process, we are inadvertently starving our own humanity.
And speaking of optimizing society and the dangers of unintended consequences, well, we need to navigate carefully into the next major theme of the source. Listeners, remember the neutrality rule we established at the beginning of the show. The source material now pivots to a very harsh, macro-level critique of the global governmental and societal response to the COVID-19 pandemic over the previous 2 years.
This is where it gets very politically charged.
We are stepping into highly polarized territory. Our objective here is strictly to outline the speaker's perspective and the mechanics of his argument impartially.
Understood. The central thesis advanced by the psychologists in the source is that global society drastically and dangerously overreacted to the pandemic, and that this overreaction was propelled primarily by profound naivety and unchecked psychological fear. He asserts that when faced with the sudden emergence of the virus, supposedly free Western societies panicked and immediately defaulted to imitating the draconian policies of totalitarian systems.
To substantiate this claim that fear rather than objective reality was driving the societal response, he points to a massive disparity in public perception. He cites polling data indicating that a staggering percentage of the general public, he specifically notes figures suggesting 50% of Democrats and 25% of Republicans in the United States believe they had a 50% chance of requiring hospitalization if they contracted the virus.
Which is mathematically far from the reality.
Right. He uses this data to argue that the populace was operating under a wildly exaggerated, mathematically false perception of the actual threat level.
Building on that premise of an amplified threat perception, the speaker claims to have engaged in direct conversations with top-level government advisors. He states that these advisors frankly admitted to him that the sweeping pandemic policies were not primarily dictated by hard medical science, but were instead heavily influenced by public opinion polls.
So the policy was following the fear.
The core argument here is that governmental policy was reverse-engineered to placate an unwarranted, mathematically inaccurate public hysteria rather than to execute a measured, scientifically sound public health strategy. This naturally leads into his severe criticism of pharmaceutical companies. He notes that these corporations have historically been the subject of some of the largest criminal fines and lawsuits in judicial history, and therefore it is dangerously naive to blindly trust them as the unquestioned arbiters of global health policy.
He reserves his harshest condemnation, however, for the political class. He accuses politicians of a fundamental abdication of their core leadership responsibilities. When elected leaders repeatedly justified unprecedented lockdowns and mandates by stating, "We are just following the science," the source views that not as a defense, but as a confession of cowardice.
Because politics and medicine are two very different things.
As he delineates, the discipline of medicine and the art of politics are entirely different domains. Medicine is hyper-focused on optimizing a single variable, stopping the transmission of a pathogen. Politics, conversely, is supposed to be the heavy burden of analyzing the entire complex societal ecosystem. A true leader must balance the medical data against the catastrophic risks of economic collapse, the devastation of disrupted supply chains, and the profound psychological damage inflicted by prolonged isolation.
Precisely. Delving into specific policy critiques, the source openly questions the scientific rigor backing the efficacy of widespread mask mandates. He strongly critiques the implementation of blunt lockdown strategies, referencing a paper that suggested societies were essentially locking down 1,000 individuals to prevent a single case of transmission, which he views as a wildly disproportionate and destructive ratio.
He also mentions kids. Right?
He does. He challenges the scientific justification for vaccinating young children under 12, arguing that their statistical risk of severe outcomes from the virus was infinitesimally small, making the intervention unnecessary in his view.
Now, I want to step back from the specific medical debates regarding masks or vaccine efficacy. Let's look at the underlying philosophy. At one point, the interviewer asks him a direct hypothetical. If you were president of the world, how would you have handled this crisis? The speaker immediately rejects the premise. He refuses the hypothetical power, stating that his ultimate goals are theological and focused on the individual, not political control.
He's not interested in being a dictator, even a benevolent one.
Right. Regardless of where a listener might stand on the specific pandemic measures, what is the core philosophical mechanism the source is detailing here regarding the relationship between the individual, the state, and the concept of expertise during a massive crisis?
The philosophical engine driving his critique is a profound, historically grounded distrust of top-down, centralized authority attempting to micromanage infinitely complex human ecosystems. The source views the reflexive reliance on specialized, isolated experts as a dangerous fragmentation of holistic wisdom.
You lose the big picture.
Philosophically, he argues that when a society allows deceit, panic, and the illusion of control to pollute its collective reasoning during a crisis, it is building its foundation on sand. When the winds of a genuine existential threat blow, a society that has willingly traded its individual courage, its capacity for risk assessment, and its holistic judgment in exchange for centralized, fear-based dictates will inevitably face catastrophic consequences.
So what's the defense against that?
The only viable defense against totalitarianism, in his view, is continuously fortifying the resilience, the competence, and the truthfulness of the sovereign individual, rather than infinitely expanding the emergency powers of the state.
If the state is always naturally expanding and at risk of overreach, how do we keep it in check? The speaker transitions from this critique of state power into a fascinating biological analysis of the political systems themselves. He breaks down the inherent temperaments of society, specifically examining the psychological architecture that separates conservatives from liberals. And he doesn't frame this as a debate over who is right or wrong, but rather as a biological necessity.
This analysis relies heavily on the field of psychometrics, which is the psychological measurement of personality traits, specifically the Big Five personality model. The expert outlines that our political affiliations are not merely intellectual choices arrived at through pure reason. They are heavily predetermined by our inherent biological personality temperaments.
Let's start with conservatives.
Conservatives statistically test significantly higher in a trait called conscientiousness. In neuropsychological terms, high conscientiousness correlates with being naturally orderly, industrious, dutiful, and highly sensitive to disgust and boundary violations. They are the managerial class. They care deeply about maintaining borders, upholding established structures, and ensuring the complex machinery of society operates reliably without breaking down.
And on the other side of the spectrum, what is the biological driver for liberals?
Liberals test much higher in a completely different trait called openness to experience. This trait is associated with lateral thinking, boundary dissolution, and high creativity. It makes them naturally divergent thinkers and entrepreneurial. They're far less constrained by traditional order and much more compelled to explore the unknown, dismantle outdated structures, and seek novel solutions.
To ground this in a real-world scenario, let's use a business analogy. If you are running a massive corporation, you absolutely require the conservative temperament in the executive suite. You need highly conscientious people to ensure the trains run on time, the payroll clears, the legal liabilities are minimized, and the existing revenue structures don't collapse into chaos.
They keep the lights on.
Right. But if your entire company is composed exclusively of conservatives, the business will eventually stagnate and die. Why? Because the external environment inevitably changes. A new technology emerges, and the conservative instinct to just protect the old model fails. You desperately need the liberal temperament in your research and development department. You need them to pepper the organization with off-the-wall, rule-breaking creative ideas to invent the entirely new product that will save the company from bankruptcy in 5 years.
The analogy holds perfectly at the macro-societal level. You cannot simply replicate the structures of the past mindlessly because the future is an ever-shifting, unknown territory. Therefore, both the conservative impulse to preserve order and the liberal impulse to adapt to change are biologically and evolutionarily essential for the survival of the species and the navigation of the ship of state.
But here is the critical problem. If these two factions are fundamentally, biologically wired to perceive reality in entirely incompatible ways, one prioritizing borders and order, the other prioritizing openness and disruption, how do they coexist? How do they keep the ship of state from just ripping itself apart in a violent civil war?
The source identifies a single definitive mechanism to solve this biological impasse: free speech. Within this framework, free speech is not merely a political luxury or just another right jotted down on a piece of parchment. It is the master evolutionary mechanism.
It's the only way out.
It is the sole tool that permits these diametrically opposed temperaments to engage in a continuous, frictionless, nonviolent dialogue. Without the absolute protection of free speech, the conservative temperament inevitably metastasizes into a tyrant of rigid order, or the liberal temperament devolves into an agent of unmitigated chaos. Dialogue is the literal process of societal echolocation. It is how these competing psychologies negotiate the treacherous path forward into the unknown without resorting to physical bloodshed.
That concept of dialogue, of speaking, and crucially listening, brings us down from the macro politics of the state right back to the micro level of interpersonal relationships. Because dialogue is how we interact with the people sitting right in front of us. This leads into the source's exploration of the art of listening and the dangerous illusion of giving advice. Imagine you have a close friend who comes to you in a state of deep despair. Their life is falling apart. The immediate natural human instinct is to rush in, diagnose their problem for them, and deliver a step-by-step lecture on exactly what they need to do to fix their life.
And the source's directive here is jarringly blunt. Disabuse yourself immediately of the arrogant, narcissistic notion that you know what is best for another human being. You do not possess omniscient knowledge of their destiny. Furthermore, you do not want to bear the terrifying karmic responsibility of issuing life-altering directives to someone else.
Why is it so dangerous? We usually think we are performing an act of compassion by offering our wisdom.
It is dangerous because of the hidden psychological consequences. Let us play out the scenario. You give your friend advice, they follow your precise instructions, and they succeed. Who actually won the victory?
We did.
You did. You have subtly stolen their triumph. You proved your own competence at the expense of their autonomy. Conversely, if you give them advice and the strategy fails catastrophically, they are the ones left holding the bag. They pay the brutal, real-world price of the failure, while you can simply wash your hands of the situation and rationalize it by saying, well, the advice was sound, they just lacked the discipline to execute it properly. Giving advice is frequently an arrogant usurpation of another person's necessary life journey.
It makes me think of a bad detective arriving at a complex crime scene. A terrible detective walks under the yellow tape with a preformed theory already locked in their head. They aggressively force every piece of evidence they find to fit their preconceived bias. If they find a clue that contradicts their theory, they ignore it. But a master detective walks into the room, remains completely silent, observes the chaos without judgment, and allows the evidence to speak to them organically.
A highly illustrative comparison. The required alternative to dispensing advice is the grueling discipline of genuine listening. The source contrasts two radically different types of questions to highlight this. He mentions encounters with religious traditionalists at his public speaking events who will stand up and deliver heavily packaged, manipulative questions. They are not seeking truth. They are setting a rhetorical trap, trying to corner him into validating their pre-existing ideological framework.
They already know what they want him to say.
Exactly. A genuine question, by contrast, is formulated in a state of absolute humble ignorance. It is an invitation for the other person to reveal the truth of their experience.
This connects beautifully to the analogy he makes regarding the comedian Jimmy Carr. He points out that elite stand-up comedy is not a monologue. It is actually a highly sophisticated dialogical dance with the collective unconscious of the audience. Before a comedian films a massive arena special, they spend a year doing hundreds of grueling shows in tiny, dark clubs. They aren't there to lecture the crowd. They are there as scientists testing hypotheses. They throw out a premise, and they listen. The laughter is the data. They allow the audience to inform them of what is genuinely true and funny, rather than arrogantly trying to force their own conceptualization of humor down the audience's throat.
Listening is the mechanism that allows the other person to untangle their own chaotic thoughts in real time. And the source derives an incredibly powerful, intensely practical tool from this philosophy for navigating romantic conflicts. When you find yourself locked in a bitter, cyclical argument with your partner, instead of desperately trying to win the debate or prove your intellectual superiority, you must stop, drop your ego, and ask a terrifyingly vulnerable question. What are your preconditions for satisfaction?
That feels almost impossible to execute in the heat of a screaming match. When you are furious, the last thing you want to do is ask how to surrender.
It requires immense psychological discipline. By asking that question, you are essentially saying, what specific action could I take? Or what specific words could I say right now, even if I perform them clumsily, that would actually satisfy your grievance and restore peace between us? This maneuver forces the angry partner to halt their endless venting of abstract resentment and articulate a concrete, actionable goal.
And then you actually have to do it.
And the critical second half of the hack is that once they articulate the precondition, you must genuinely attempt to execute it. It is a profound, real-world demonstration of prioritizing good faith and listening over the hollow victory of the ego.
Stepping back from the ego leads us directly into our final exploration today, the true nature of happiness and the actual antidote to human suffering. The transcript concludes with a deeply moving philosophical reflection. A previous guest on the interviewer's podcast had left a simple question written in a diary for the speaker to answer. The question was, "Are you happy?" But the interviewer, having spent hours absorbing the psychologist's framework, realizes in real time that this is entirely the wrong question to pose, because the speaker's core philosophy explicitly states, aim to be good and pray for happiness.
The expert systematically deconstructs the modern obsession with maximizing happiness. He utilizes a brilliant auditory metaphor comparing the pursuit of mere happiness to elevator music.
Elevator music. It's such a strange comparison, but it makes immediate sense.
Elevator music is designed to be sweet, simple, and entirely harmless. It smooths over the silence, but it utterly lacks complexity and depth. If your primary objective in life is to curate an existence that sounds like elevator music, avoiding all friction, dodging responsibility, seeking only pleasant sensations, you are constructing a dangerously shallow reality. The moment genuine tragedy strikes, which is an inevitability in the human condition, the elevator music will instantly shatter, leaving you defenseless against the darkness.
He contrasts the shallow elevator music of happiness with the deep, resonant music of the 1950s blues cowboy, Hank Williams. He describes this specific genre of music as possessing a simple surface melody, but containing an oceanic depth underneath. The music is built upon the absolute agonizing admission of profound human suffering, betrayal, and loss, but it is paired with a beautiful artistic transcendence. It is the act of taking the tragedy of life and forging it into something beautiful.
That exact combination, suffering articulated truthfully and then transcended through courageous action or art, is the formula for generating meaning. And meaning, the source argues emphatically, is the actual, robust antidote to suffering. Happiness is fleeting. Meaning is what anchors you during a hurricane. Meaning moves you tectonically.
This explains why the speaker chooses to use the word terribly when the interviewer asks him how he is doing. He recounts how strangers approach him constantly in cities all over the world, often breaking down in tears in public. They aren't just politely asking for a selfie. They are revealing the absolute horrific depths of their past suicidal despair, their battles with addiction, the collapse of their families, and then they share the triumphant, arduous story of how they took responsibility and recovered.
He absorbs all of that.
He absorbs this immense, agonizing psychological weight from thousands of people. He acknowledges that carrying these stories is a tremendous, exhausting burden, but he concludes that bearing this almost unbearable meaning is infinitely superior to existing in a state of mere shallow happiness.
It serves as the ultimate justification for the entire dense, challenging philosophical framework we have unpacked today. Why should you voluntarily undergo the agonizing psychological pain of dismantling your social persona? Why should you willingly shoulder the terrifying historical responsibility of your unearned privilege? Why should you choose to face the chaotic uphill battle of the real world instead of retreating into the numbing comfort of a virtual reality?
Why do any of it?
The speaker offers a final answer that is breathtaking in its simplicity and its courage. To see what will happen. You adopt the terrifying operating system of speaking the absolute truth, you execute the program, and you simply let it run, accepting whatever catastrophic or beautiful consequences follow, fueled by a fundamental, unshakable faith that truth, ultimately, is the only force capable of saving the world.
Okay, let's take a breath and look at the massive terrain we just covered. We started at the absolute ground level, identifying the arrogant pride that prevents us from cleaning a messy bedroom, and the clinical pragmatism required to fix the inadequacies on a resume. We climbed through the psychological terror of dropping our protective social masks to find genuine connection.
We waded through the heavy, blood-soaked existential guilt of historical atrocity, navigated the deep biological temperaments that drive our fractured politics, and ultimately arrived at the realization that true human fulfillment is found not in the sweet, shallow elevator music of a beach retirement, but in the deep, unbearable, uphill pursuit of meaning.
It is a sweeping, comprehensive roadmap designed to lead an individual out of the paralyzing grip of modern nihilism. It is a philosophy that demands we unequivocally reject the narrative of victimization and instead embrace the terrifying reality that we're the sole architects of our own rescue, armed with nothing but the courage to tell the truth.
Which is an incredible call to action.
It really is. Which brings us to our final thought for today. The speaker utilized that fascinating analogy of speaking the truth, being akin to running a computer program, just to see what will happen. I want you to apply that mechanism to the trajectory of your own life right now. Take a hard look at the code you are currently executing. If you have been running the deceit program, or if you have been letting the persona algorithm dictate your choices for the last 5 years, what exactly is the output going to look like 5 years from now? Are you just programming more of the same hidden desperation? And more importantly, what happens the exact moment you finally gather the courage to uninstall it?
A profound and necessary question to leave them with.
Thank you all for joining us on this incredible, expansive deep dive. Stay curious, stay honest, and we will see you next time.